She never wanted the fame, never reached for the microphone, never tried to make herself part of a story the whole world had already claimed as its own. But Amy Guthrie didn't need to reach for it. She was born into it. She was the story. Welcome back to Cold Case History. I am going to walk you through every detail of this case, the footage, the forensics, the suspect behavior, the DNA, and the digital evidence trail. If you are new here, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. We cover every update on cases like this one the moment they break. And trust me, this one is not finished breaking yet. Let's begin at the beginning. Close your eyes for just a moment. Picture what it would feel like to grow up inside a name so enormous, so deeply embedded in the bones of a nation, that strangers feel they own a piece of it before you've ever said a word. A name written into the soul of American music, American protest, American pain. A name that teachers say with reverence, that musicians whisper like a prayer, that historians build entire careers around without ever once knocking on the door and asking the family how they're doing. Now understand that this name has followed Annie Guthrie every single day of her life, not as a gift wrapped in glory, but as something heavier, something more complicated than any outsider has ever been willing to acknowledge. For decades, she held back. She watched the films get made and the museums fill up and the anniversaries get celebrated with speeches and flowers and acoustic guitars. She watched the world construct an altar to her family while she stood somewhere just beyond the frame, carrying pieces of the real story that nobody seemed particularly interested in collecting. But silence is not a permanent condition. It is a decision. And Annie Guthrie has made a different one. What she has chosen to say is not what you're expecting. It isn't explosive. It isn't a reckoning delivered in anger. It is rarer than that, and in many ways more powerful. It is simply, carefully, and irrevocably the truth. The full, complicated, beautifully imperfect truth behind one of the most mythologized families in the entire history of American culture. Stay close, because by the time this story is done, you will not hear the music quite the same way. You will not understand the legacy quite the same way. And you may not look at any inherited stories, quite the same way again. There is no landmark plaque on the house. No tour bus slows down at the corner. No souvenir stand sells refrigerator magnets bearing its image. But if you know the Guthrie story at its root level, if you know it below the mythology and beneath the monument, you understand why that house matters. Not because a legend was born there, but because a family was. A real one. Flawed and tender and struggling. The kind of family that the official version of the legend quietly left behind. Annie grew up knowing the weight of what her last name meant to everyone else. She heard her grandfather's songs drifting from other people's radios. She saw his face on posters held up by people marching for causes he never lived to see the end of. She listened to scholars and journalists speak about her family with unshakable confidence, pronouncing what they believed, what they stood for, who they truly were. And every time, some small thing inside her would tighten, because what they were describing was not quite the family she knew. The family she knew ate breakfast together. The family she knew had silences that lasted too long and arguments that resolved too slowly and love expressed in all the halting, imperfect ways that real love tends to move through real people. That was the story nobody was telling. And Annie was the one sitting quietly with all of it. She speaks carefully, every word placed like something she has turned over in her hands for a long time before releasing it. When she pauses, it is not because she doesn't know what to say. It is because she respects the weight of saying it correctly. She has spent her entire life watching people trade accuracy for elegance, watching the rougher edges of the family's real experience get filed down into something smoother and more palatable, something that fit better inside a frame. And she understood why it happened. She did. Symbols, by their very nature, can't afford to be too human. Symbols don't get to be exhausted or confused or quietly devastated by the distance between who they are and who the world keeps insisting they must be. Her grandfather was a human being. Her grandmother was a human being. The whole tangled, breathing, difficult, magnificent household was made of human beings. And for far too long, the world preferred the monument to the people who built it. Her purpose in finally speaking is not to pull anything down. She is very clear about this. The word she keeps returning to is whole. She wants to make the story whole. Because a legacy assembled entirely from myth will, over enough time, slowly hollow itself out. But a legacy grounded in full human truth, that one has the kind of weight that actually endures. The first thing Annie wants corrected, the foundational correction beneath everything else, is this. Her grandfather was not trying to become a legend. He was trying to survive. That may sound unremarkable, but Annie believes it is the single most important thing to understand about him, because the romantic mythology of the traveling folk poet has almost completely displaced the reality of a man who spent most of his life in genuine, grinding desperation. He rode freight trains not for the poetry of it. He rode them because he had nothing else. He played music on street corners, not from some elevated sense of artistic calling. He played because some days music was the only wall standing between him and total collapse. Annie first heard these stories told at low volume, in the fading light of late afternoons, by a woman with a memory precise enough to put archivists to shame. Her grandmother kept every detail intact, not out of bitterness, Annie is careful to say, but out of honesty. She was not a bitter woman. She loved deeply and she grieved deeply, and she held the entire structure of the family together through conditions that would have unmade most people entirely. But she had no patience, none at all, for the way outsiders had decided to romanticize what she had actually lived through. The Dust Bowl, the Depression, the open road. American culture has softened those things into something that almost looks like adventure from a safe enough distance. But Annie grew up hearing what they felt like from a woman who had stood inside them. They felt like terror. They felt like not knowing. They felt like looking across a table at your children's faces and wondering every single day whether you had done nearly enough. Annie was 10 years old the first time she understood that her family was different in a way that came from outside, not inside. A teacher played one of her grandfather's songs in class. Her classmates hadn't yet connected her name to the music. She sat still and watched their faces as the song moved through the room, and she saw something reach them, some note of recognition, some chord struck in a place most 10-year-olds don't even know they carry. A few heads turned. The teacher gave her that particular smile. Warm, certain, loaded. The smile that says you carry something larger than yourself. And Annie smiled back, because even at 10 she understood that was the expected thing to do. But the walk home that afternoon was long. She couldn't stop turning over the gap between what she had just witnessed in that classroom and what she actually knew. The song was enormous, pointed and sure of itself, aimed straight at the future. Her family, the real one, the one that passed the butter and forgot things and occasionally said the wrong thing at the worst possible moment, was smaller than that. More fragile, far more difficult to contain inside a single chord. At 10, she didn't have the language for it. It would take most of a lifetime to find those words. And those words, it turns out, are exactly the ones the rest of us have been quietly waiting to hear. There is a chapter of the Guthrie story that has almost never been told publicly. Not because it was deliberately concealed, not because anyone sat down and decided it should be buried, but because the people living inside it simply never believed the world would receive it with the care it actually deserved. These were the years after the noise had quieted, after the biographies had settled onto their shelves and the documentaries had finished their runs. These were the years when the family was finally left alone with each other and with the complicated, daily reality of living inside a name that other people had largely written the definition of. One person in particular, someone who grew up in the interior of all this, spent years working quietly through a question that sounds simple but carried tremendous weight. Who was he allowed to be, now that the world had already decided what he was supposed to represent? He was thoughtful, Annie says, far more deeply thoughtful than people gave him credit for, because he was also funny and warm and disarmingly social. And people sometimes read that warmth as lightness when underneath it there were real depths. His music was his answer to the question. Each song its own small act of self-definition. A quiet, ongoing declaration that said, I am also here. My story is also real. My life also belongs to me. Annie watched that work. She carried it. If you're still here, subscribe, because cases like this only work when people stay and tell us where you're watching from. I love seeing my global family represent. Drop your country or city in the comments. The hardest part of all those years of silence, Annie says, was watching small inaccuracies calcify into accepted history. She would read a profile, a liner note, a chapter in a well-reviewed book, and find something slightly wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, just wrong in the quiet, cumulative way that minor errors compound across decades until the portrait assembled is no longer quite the person who actually existed. She reached for the phone. She started letters. She stopped. Because there is a particular, suffocating loneliness that comes with being the keeper of a private truth when the public myth is something that people love fiercely and want protected. Offer a correction and you risk becoming the person trying to diminish something beautiful. Introduce complexity and watch the room cool. She knew this. So she waited, carefully, for the moment and the language and the surety to trust that she could offer the full truth without having it bent into something she never meant. That moment is now. Not because everything has resolved itself perfectly. It hasn't. But because Annie arrived at the understanding that the silence itself was causing harm. That a legacy left entirely in the hands of people who had never lived inside it would eventually drift so far from the real thing that no compass would lead anyone back. And then she says something that surprises nearly everyone who hears it. She says there was so much laughter in that house. When people construct the Guthrie household in their imagination, they tend to build it solemn. They picture people permanently aware of their place in history, moving carefully through rooms weighted with significance, always conscious, always carrying the gravity of the name. But Annie shakes her head at this. There were meals that turned into concerts, she says. Concerts that somehow dissolved into arguments about nothing in particular. Her grandmother's sense of humor was precisely calibrated and absolutely lethal in the best possible way. Her father could be genuinely, delightfully absurd. The house was full of noise and music and the beautiful mess of people who loved each other imperfectly and loudly, and without much regard for how it looked from the outside. This matters, Annie says. It matters because the relentless gravity with which the legacy has been treated has made it, quietly and gradually, harder for ordinary people to find themselves in it. When a family becomes entirely symbolic, entirely historical, entirely serious, they stop being recognizably human. And when they stop being human, the actual lessons of their lives stop landing, because people can no longer find the place where the story touches their own. The Guthrie legacy, at its truest core, is about ordinary people doing extraordinary things under extraordinary pressure. But ordinary people burn toast. Ordinary people say exactly the wrong thing and have to go back and fix it. Ordinary people get up the next morning anyway, without fanfare, without a film crew, without anyone writing it down. That, Annie says quietly, is the actual inheritance. There was a period in her adult life when she stepped back from all of it. Not in anger, not with ceremony, no announcement, no letter, no public statement. She simply, gradually, let the distance grow between herself and the ongoing public conversation about her family name, and focused everything she had on building her own life instead. She needed to make her own decisions without stopping every few steps to measure what they meant in the context of the legacy. She needed to fail on her own terms and succeed on her own terms, and simply, concretely, be a person without the name functioning as a compass or a weight or a mirror. That period lasted years, and she says, without any hesitation, that it was some of the most essential time she has ever spent. Because when she came back, when she allowed herself back into the larger conversation about what the Guthrie story truly was, she came back knowing exactly where she stood. Not because she had been told, because she had tested herself against her own life and her own choices and found that the values at the center of the story were not merely inherited. They were hers, arrived at independently, through her own experience, on her own terms. That discovery gave her something no documentary could ever hand her. It gave her the right to speak. The correction Annie feels most urgently, the one that sits deepest, is this. The legacy has never been about one person. The folk hero mythology has always tightened itself around a single figure, the lone voice, the lone wanderer, the lone visionary. And that figure was real and remarkable. But reducing everything to one person has quietly, systematically, for decades, erased a great deal of what actually happened. Behind every song, there were conversations. Behind every conviction, there were late-night arguments and questions nobody felt like asking, and people who pushed, and people who believed, and people who stayed when staying was genuinely difficult. Her grandmother shaped that entire worldview at its roots. Annie says this with a controlled precision that tells you immediately how much is underneath it. Her grandmother was not a supporting character. She was an intellectual and emotional architect whose courage was, in many ways, the unseen foundation that made all this celebrated courage possible. And Annie wants her named, not as a footnote, not as a wife, as a full, complete human being who made real decisions under real pressure, whose inner life was as rich and as worthy of honest examination as anyone else in the story. The women inside the Guthrie story were not behind it. They were inside it. Every difficult step of the way. When Annie finally began speaking publicly, she expected resistance. She expected people who had built comfortable interpretations of the legacy to feel threatened by the complications she was carefully introducing. She expected the myth to push back. What she found instead were people who had been quietly sensing for years that something was missing. People who had read every biography and felt the edges were just slightly too smooth, too deliberate, too clean. People who loved the music with everything they had but sensed, without quite being able to say it, that the full humanity behind it had been gently, professionally sanded away. They weren't looking for a takedown. They were looking for a human being. And when Annie gave them one, when she gave them laughter and exhaustion and a grandmother finally standing at full height, they didn't feel that the story had shrunk. They felt, for the first time, that it had actually arrived. Annie knew this was possible. She had always known. She just needed the world to be ready. And the world, it turns out, had been ready for a very long time. It was just waiting for someone who had actually been there to finally step forward and say so. There is something quietly radical about choosing truth in an age that would rather maintain the myth. Annie Guthrie didn't break her silence to cause damage. She broke it to close a gap that had been widening for decades, between what the world believed and what actually happened, between the symbol and the living person, between the legend and the life behind it. And maybe that's the question worth carrying with you when you leave this video. Not just about the Guthries, but about every story you've ever inherited without questioning it. Who is still quiet right now? Whose version has never once been requested? What would genuinely shift if the people who were actually inside the story were finally trusted to tell it? Because every legacy has its Annie. Someone standing just outside the frame, holding the piece of the truth that never made the final cut. Someone who stayed silent not out of indifference, but out of care, waiting with tremendous patience for the moment when the full truth could finally be received the way it has always deserved to be. If this story hits something in you, do not let it sit quietly. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling us which part stayed with you. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is the moment, because we are going to keep going. There are more stories exactly like this one. Stories that have been waiting patiently, with tremendous dignity, for someone to finally tell them whole. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and we will see you in the next one.